Finally, okay. The stream has started and I'm at 10 seconds, 11 seconds, okay. Yeah, it was taking forever to start, so I stepped out to get my charger, so I apologize actually. Just a word of advice, when I'm apologizing, I'm not really apologizing to you, the audience. I mean, I literally turned off comments so that you can't comment on my videos. So no, I'm never really sorry to you. I'm more sorry to me because the technology is treating me very poorly. But anyway, let's get to the topic of the video. As you can see in the thumbnail, we have a picture of the warmonger, Richard Bruce Cheney, eating something. I mean, I never really looked at it very carefully, so I don't remember what he was eating. But the point is, there's a lot of I'm not going to cuss here because it's just not in my regular vocabulary. And plus, I heard that when you cuss, your video goes down in the algorithm, and the algorithm tries to bury the video if there's cuss words in it. So, I'm not going to cuss here. But there's a lot of F word BS going around. About how maybe Kamala Harris will be the heir apparent to Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris is going to be handed the nomination. Like, where the F is all this coming from? Like, seriously. Okay, let's knock out the second lie first. First of all, vice presidents don't just get handed the nomination. If you remember, Al Gore won the 2000 primary pretty easily in the Democratic Party. But he did have a competitor, and although he defeated the competitor very easily, there was still a primary process. Secondly, when Lyndon Johnson dropped out of the 1968 race after the disastrous debacle of the New Hampshire primary, Vice President Hubert Humphrey stepped in, but he didn't immediately win the nomination. He had to try and struggle for it, and then he eventually got it. And George H.W. Bush, he wasn't handed the nomination in the Republican primary either. I mean, Hubert Humphrey was a Democrat, obviously, but George H.W. Bush wasn't handed the Republican nomination easily. He had to also compete a little bit for it, even though he did also win fairly easily. But that's just because he was a big name. I mean, he was a horrible president, obviously, and a good riddance to him, by the way. But anyway, the point is, vice presidents don't just get handed the nomination. Of course, many of the recent vice presidents have been corporate stooges, puppets. So the establishment favors them, and the money in politics is on their side. But that still doesn't mean they just get handed the nomination. Let's just be very clear. Secondly, where the F is this heir apparent nonsense coming from? Do you think a person with a 28% approval rating is an heir apparent? And secondly, most vice presidents never become president. Only 15 out of 49 vice presidents, we're on the 49th vice president right now with Harris, only 15 vice presidents have ever become president, and most of them were by accident. And also, that means 34 vice presidents have never become president. So let's go through all the vice presidents who became president and why. And then we'll go through all the vice presidents who never became president and why. So first, let's start with Vice President John Adams. He became the president. Vice President John Adams ran for president while he was the vice president, and he won, and he was a one-term vice president because he lost his re-election. He did not get elected to a second term. So there's John Adams. Vice President Thomas Jefferson ran for president while he was vice president. He won. He was a two-term president. Vice President Martin Van Buren, much like Vice President John Adams, Vice President Martin Van Buren ran for president while he was vice president. He won one term, and then he lost the next time, so he was a one-term president. Vice President George H.W. Bush ran for president while he was vice president. He won. He was also a one-term president because he was awful. His policies were terrible. The wars, the literal foreign policy wars, in addition to the drug war, in addition to the economic recession and just disastrous. He was basically just Ronald Reagan Jr. So, I mean, those were some of the horrible policy reasons that he won. And of course, some of the horrible policy reasons that Martin Van Buren won was because of the economic crash, the Panic of 1837, why he was called Martin Van Ruin. But anyway, yeah, those are the policy points. But Adams, Jefferson, Van Buren, and Bush, Adams Sr. and Bush Sr., by the way, Adams Sr., Jefferson, Van Buren, and Bush Sr., those four are the only four sitting vice presidents who got elected president while they were sitting vice presidents. And of course, Al Gore, the 2000 election was rightfully his. Of course, it was his, and he did win, but it was taken away from him, so he did not become president, even though he should have. Now, but since he never became president, he's not being counted in this list, obviously. So we have Adams Sr., Jefferson, Van Buren, and Bush Sr., those four. And then who do we have next? The two presidents who were former vice presidents when they got elected president. Richard Nixon had been out of office. He finished his vice presidency in 1961, and then he ran for president in 1968. He actually, of course, it should be noted that he had run for president while he was vice president and totally failed at that. But the point is, Richard Milhouse Nixon, was the former vice president when he ran for president and got elected president. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the current president of the United States, he was a former vice president when he got elected president. He'd been out of office for 3 years because he finished his vice presidency in 2017 and got elected in 2020. So Nixon and Biden, the only two former vice presidents who got elected president. So we have those six. Now, who are the other 9? Let's go through them one by one. We have about 4 presidents who became president initially because the president died. They've been vice president and the president died, so they had to step up and step in and become the president. And then they filled in, but then they also won the next presidential election on their own right. So who were they? Well, first of all, you have Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, who was the vice president for 6 months. He got in during President William McKinley's second term. And 6 months into President William McKinley's second term, President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist named Leon, and his last name I can't really pronounce it because I forgot what it was, and also it was very hard to pronounce. But the point is, President William McKinley, who was a warmonger who put civilians in concentration camps after massacring most of them, and was a Christian fundamentalist who apparently heard God's voice and used to declare illegal war and annex territories and did a lot of imperialism. That guy got assassinated. So Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, who had the same policies, by the way, Vice President Teddy Roosevelt became the president, and Vice President Teddy Roosevelt filled in the rest of that term, but then he won the following presidential election in 1904, and he won another term, so he was president from 1901 to 1909. So Teddy Roosevelt initially became president because the previous president, got assassinated, but then Teddy Roosevelt managed to win a presidential election in his own right. He had horrible foreign policy, so F him, but the point is. Now, Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the president because the president, Warren Harding, who was known for his cabinet taking illegal bribes and deregulation of tax cuts for the wealthy, and of course he was misusing World War I veterans' funds. But anyway, that guy, Warren Harding, had a heart attack and passed away. So Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the new president, and then Vice President Calvin Coolidge filled out the rest of the term. He became president in 1923 and ran the election in 1924. He won that election mainly because although Calvin Coolidge was for tax cuts, deregulation, tax cuts for the rich, I'm talking about, and massive just let corporations do everything mentality. And of course, he hated unions and he was busting up pro-labor movements. The Democrat running against Calvin Coolidge was a Republican. The Democrat running against Calvin Coolidge was John Davis, and John Davis pretty much had the same policies as Calvin Coolidge, also loved the deregulation nonsense. So that's why Calvin Coolidge won that election very easily, because when they have a Republican light, they go with Republican. That's just the way it works. So have better policies and believe in something. But the point is, Calvin Coolidge became president initially because the president died, but he managed to win on his own right because he won, as I just mentioned, the policies right. Why? And then Harry Truman. Harry S. Truman was the vice president during the fourth term of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which lasted 3 months because President FDR had polio for a long time, and then he had cerebral hemorrhage, bleeding inside the brain, and then had a stroke and died. So Vice President Harry Truman became the new president, and then he won the election of 1948 on his own right, on his own merits. And he really did win on his merits, because if you look at the way he ran his campaign, his message was, hey, I'm Harry Truman, the Democrat. The Republicans who control the 80th Congress right now, they pass right-to-work laws, and they want to crush your unions, and they want you to keep working for them until you fall over, and they're pro-corporate rule, and those SOBs, they don't care about you. They don't care about the working class. They want to screw you. While I, Harry S. Truman, am for your unions. I am for the working class. I am for universal health care. I'm going to protect your health. I'm going to give you health care, protect your livelihoods, work for the unions, make sure that the working class is well cared for, and I'm going to do policies that materially improve your lives. So vote for me, Harry Truman. And then Harry Truman easily won the election in 1948. So if you run on policies and believe in something, you happen to win. And it should also be noted that the polls that showed Truman down and Thomas Dewey up, those polls were conducted by phone, and most households didn't have telephones at the time, so that's why the polls were skewed to make it seem like Dewey was pulling ahead of Truman. So it was just not true, because the sample size was not big enough. But the point is, run on policies and actually believe in something that's good, because of course there's also people who believe in policies that are bad, so don't do that. But the point is, and let's move on to the fourth option, very similar to Harry S. Truman, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He became president because the president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, got assassinated in 1963. On November 22nd, 1963. It's been 58 years and 1 month and 1 day. But anyway, LBJ became Vice President LBJ, became President LBJ, and then he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then he ran in 1964, and he won in a huge landslide, 486 electoral votes. Why? Because LBJ was saying, I'm for universal health care. I'm for immigration reform that increases immigration. I am for the working class, my Great Society program, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare. I created federal student loan debt, not debt, but he created federal student loans. He did not create the debt. He was against the debt. Yeah, I don't want to misstate anything, but yeah, he created federal student loans to help students. But the point is, Lyndon Johnson was running on material policies that improve people's lives. Of course, the problem with Lyndon Johnson was that his foreign policy was incredibly hawkish. However, the dude running against him, Barry Goldwater was even more hawkish. So when you have a guy who's horrible on foreign policy and very hawkish, but is very good on domestic policy, versus a guy who is even worse on foreign policy and even more hawkish, and is also horrible on domestic policy, you go with the guy who still has the horrible foreign policy but the good domestic policies. But in reality, you really should have good foreign policy too. So don't don't advocate like giving yourself illegal war powers like Lyndon Johnson did. Yeah, but anyway, moving on. So Teddy Roosevelt, Coolidge, Truman, Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, those four are the presidents who became vice presidents who became president because the president died, but still won the next presidential election on their own merits. Of course, actually, Coolidge didn't have merits. He just gave money to rich people and cut their taxes and deregulated their industry. So, but anyway, so we've gone through about 10 presidents now. 4 vice presidents who were elected president while they were vice president, 2 vice presidents who were out of office when they got elected president, and 4 vice presidents who became president because the president died and yet still managed to win the next presidential election on their own merits. Now we get to so there's only 10 of them, 10 out of 49 who truly won on their own merits and managed to become president. So 10 out of 49, that means 39 were never able to do that. So 10, like those 10 are, imagine how rare that is. Just think about it. Vice presidents never become president. That's the point I'm trying to make here. But if we go on to the next people that I'm about to mention, the 5 accidents, so there's 15 in total, as I mentioned, 15 vice presidents who became president. So who were the other 5? Total accidents who really never should have been president in the first place. John Tyler, Vice President John Tyler, became president because the president, William Henry Harrison, died. Now, William Henry Harrison, in addition to having been a war criminal in his past, with his treatment of Native Americans when he was a general, that guy had pneumonia and he was only president for 1 month and he died. So Vice President John Tyler became the new president. And of course, at the time, 1841, April 4th, 1841, the Constitution wasn't clear as to how long the vice president should take over for the president died. So Vice President John Tyler interpreted as the vice president can just take over the rest of the term type of deal, whereas some other people were interpreting it as maybe the vice president should only be the acting president. So there was almost a constitutional crisis, not quite, but almost. And basically, that was the first time a president had ever died in office, so that was why. But the point is, President John Tyler's policies were absolutely horrible, and he was very, how do I say this? He was very bad. His policies were terrible. And he was pro-Southern, like he exacerbated the issues of division in the country, and he was just a disaster. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but he might have been buried with a Confederate flag, actually. So that tells you exactly what kind of person he was. Now, Vice President Millard Fillmore became the president because President Zachary Taylor died. President Zachary Taylor had been a war criminal from the 1844 Mexican-American War. And Zachary Taylor wasn't even very politically involved. He didn't even know what policies he believed in except for endless war because he never even voted in a presidential election before. But, the Whigs wanted him, so they nominated him, made him their nominee, and he won the presidency. But he got a stomach disease and died. So, that's what happened to him. And so what happened is that President Zach Taylor dies, Vice President Millard Fillmore becomes the president, and Millard Fillmore had horrendous policies, most notably the Fugitive Slave Act, which was disastrous. That was Millard Fillmore. And then, of course, you had Vice President Andrew Johnson became president because President Abraham Lincoln got assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson was absolutely horrendous, like anti-civil rights, very racist. His policies were horrible. He pardoned a bunch of Confederates, including John Breckinridge, and it's just if his policies looked in a mirror, the mirror would crack like it. Total disaster. And of course, Vice President Chester Arthur became president because the president James Garfield, James Abram Garfield, by the way, was a non-interventionist against corruption, pro-civil rights, and he had a lot of good policies. And the only bad thing about him was that he got shot and then infected because of the tools that the doctors were using to treat him, and they were not sterilized properly, so he got an infection and then he died. So technically he was assassinated, because if the assassin had not shot him, if Charles Guiteau had never shot him, he wouldn't have been in that situation where he would have needed the medical treatment that infected him. So, but the point is, yeah, good policies, but got assassinated. How sad. But yeah, Chester Arthur, Vice President Chester Arthur, became the new president, and he was a disaster. He passed the Xenophobic Chinese Exclusion Act. So it should be noted that John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester Arthur, those four only became president because the president died. And in the next presidential election, they didn't win. John Tyler, I don't even remember if John Tyler lost the primary or if he just wasn't able to run or if he lost. But the point is, in the next presidential election, James Polk won. And yeah, John Tyler got forgotten, and his only time in the presidency was because he'd filled in for the dead president. Same thing with Millard Fillmore, who actually ran for president a few times, but got totally destroyed, and because no one liked him. Same thing with Andrew Johnson. The Democrats wouldn't even nominate Andrew Johnson. The Democrats wouldn't even nominate Andrew Johnson because everyone hated him. Remember, he was almost convicted after his impeachment. But the point is, and of course, Chester Arthur, Republicans didn't like him either, so the RNC made sure he wasn't nominated. And we get to the 15th vice president who became president. Actually, yeah. So Vice President Gerald Ford. Remember that Gerald Ford was only vice president because of the 25th Amendment. The Section 2 of the 25th Amendment allows for the president to appoint a new vice president should the former vice president resign. And of course, Vice President Spiro Agnew had resigned because of massive corruption, tax fraud, illegal bribes, and everything. Yeah, just imagine if bribes were still illegal in politics. Just imagine what would happen. Imagine if we got the money out of politics again, just saying. But anyway, Vice President Spiro Agnew took a plea deal and resigned from office. He was the second vice president to do so. So President Richard Nixon used the 25th Amendment, which was relatively new at the time. President Richard Nixon employed the 25th Amendment to appoint House of Representatives Republican Minority Leader Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. as the new vice president. So Jerry Ford became the vice president, and then President Richard Nixon resigned because of his horrible scandals. Watergate, I mean, honestly, Richard Nixon's foreign policy and domestic policy were horrible enough, but I mean, Watergate was bad, but people should pay more attention to his foreign policy and domestic record because those were awful. And I've done videos where I've mentioned Richard Nixon's policies and how they were incredibly destructive, and how I actually believe that Richard Nixon is much worse than George W. Bush or Donald J. Trump. I really do. Look at the policies and compare them, because even in the foreign policy body count, I think Richard Nixon comes out on top. But yeah, so the only reason that Jerry Ford was ever the president was because he'd been appointed vice president and the president happened to resign. So that's Jerry Ford literally became president on accident. So that shows you 10 vice presidents became president on their own merits, and 5 vice presidents just became president by mistake. So tells you everything you need to know. And the chances of vice president being president are very low. And I'm going to make a hot prediction and say that Kamala Harris is probably not going to be the president, and Mike Pence is probably not going to be the president. And at this point, it's way too late for Dick Cheney. And I don't think Al Gore or Dan Quayle will be president either. I mean, Dan Quayle will certainly never be president. Okay, I'm thirsty again, so I need to go drink water. I was actually going to make this video longer and go through like every single vice president and the policies they supported, and whether or not those policies mattered, or whether or not they actually have the power to enact the policies. But maybe I'll make that into a separate video. But the point is, because I was like, before I went to sleep yesterday, actually it was earlier today because I went to sleep pretty late, I was just thinking about all the vice presidents and their policies, and I was thinking maybe I'll make a YouTube video about this, and I'm making it now, but I'm really thirsty right now, and this video is almost 30 minutes long, so It's actually at like 24 minutes and actually almost 25 minutes. So the point is, I really need to drink water because I'm thirsty. It won't be Big Seltzer. Don't worry, Kyle Kalinske. But the point is, policies are important. So make sure that whenever you're looking at history or really anything in life, you're looking at it through a policy-based lens, and that you're being very substantive because that is so important to life.